Walking along a path at the roots of Pikes Peak, you notice all the signs of grace around you. The murmur of the creek, the whisper of the wind through the pine, the moon on the mountain. You only wish you had some kind of guide for all this, so you could read the signs and reflect on them. You take a fork in the path to the Ansel Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and how we all wish we could have a cool nickname like Notorious. At a corner table by the fire are three people. One of them won't shut up about a new Hulu documentary about Bigfoot, and that's me, Matthew Mellema, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. The Anselm Society is a coalition of churches across the Front Range of Colorado dedicated to one extremely simple goal, a renaissance of the Christian imagination. So to do this, we do all sorts of different events, concerts, lectures, all COVID permitting and all that, but you know the drill by now. We also have our own Guild of Artists right here in Colorado Springs. And when we aren't creating art, some of us like to podcast. So check us out over at anselmsociety.org. And while you're there, why don't you rate and review the show, your 5-star comments. They're very appreciated. I love it whenever we get a new comment. It makes my day. But now on to some of the news. If you're going to make a list of news-making things across the nation, this is very low for most people, but it's kind of high for me. Mandy Hauk, are you aware that Hulu has brought us a new Bigfoot documentary?
I was not until you just said it in the intro. So thank you for enlightening me.
Just so you know, I should probably give my wife a heads up too. This is how I plan on spending my evening. This Hulu documentary is trying to argue that Bigfoot murdered 3 cannabis farmers in Northern California several years back.
Mercy.
So Bigfoot's usually a peaceful creature, so I'm very interested to see this. But I'm getting the feeling those aren't the sort of recommendations you're looking for, Mandy. So let me give you an example of a good recommendation that I received recently.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So I saw this recommendation for a novel on Twitter. Novel was a children's Bible by Lydia Millett, but a children's Bible. And they described it as stunning, but wouldn't quite go whether it was good stunning or bad stunning. So I decided I was all in for that. And I checked it out, read it, and I agreed it was stunning, but I needed to process overnight. Okay. Then I woke up the next morning and realized I love this book. This book was brilliant. I was so glad it was recommended to me.
So it's a novel?
It is. It is called A Children's Bible. It is very much for grown-ups. Don't give it to children.
Okay.
But the reason I say this is that it was recommended on the Twitter account of our guest today, the notorious KSP herself, Karen Swallow Pryor. Welcome on the podcast.
It's good to be with you. Wow, just so much there that my head is spinning, and just the introduction.
Well, Bigfoot and literature it's just all par for the course here. But
I just want to say I'm so glad you loved a children's Bible, because I am not recommending books on Twitter anymore, because people do not they think they have the same taste as me. Like, please don't assume that. And then they read. I had so many people asking, "Oh, what children's Bible is that?" And I'm like,
"Oh dear."
It says right on the cover a novel, but anyway, I digress. But I'm so glad you liked it. I'm relieved, actually.
Oh, that's good.
I was actually reading the comments to your post, and I saw someone like, "Oh man, that's great. I've been looking for a good Bible for my kids." You're like, "No, not for children, not a Bible. Please." But yeah.
Oh, that's funny.
So we are thrilled to have you on the podcast. I am guessing that the crossover of people who enjoy this podcast and who enjoy your writing, I'm guessing there's a lot of Venn diagram overlap here. But for those who may not be familiar, just give the 30,000-foot view, who you are and what you do.
Well, I am research professor of English and Christianity and Culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. I've been an English professor for over 2 decades, so I teach literature, I write about literature, I tweet sketchy literature recommendations, and yeah, that's me, basically.
All right, so I want to get into a lot of the stuff you've been working on, some of your past books and your more recent projects. But before we do, one final question about your Twitter account. I have been noticing what appears to be Karen Swallow Pryor T-shirt merch popping up at Target. Tell me what that's all about. What is this?
It's just crazy There's Target always has these lines from different designers that they feature, and apparently there's a t-shirt that has someone that people say looks like me. It is not me, and I have nothing to do with the t-shirt, but people have decided to celebrate by getting this t-shirt, and they're going to have a KSP t-shirt day on June 21st and wear this funky, fun t-shirt. So
I agree. It looks like you. It's even got your cool, edgy haircut, and I mean, I love it.
Like me, maybe 20 years ago, maybe, but but yeah, I'll take it.
Yeah, I would. I don't have a look that would translate like that. I know Phil Vischer teased you about or complimented you, I guess.
Yeah, well, both, I think.
Both, yeah, he's Phil. He's Bob. But no, I love that t-shirt. I need it.
Okay, well, Mandy, I know what I'm getting you for this next Christmas. But
awesome. Thank you.
But I know along those lines, I had to get like my official author shots taken several years ago. Oh gosh, yeah, it was a lot of years ago when I was in much better shape and not quite as world weary as I am now. And I'm like, gosh, I really love those old pictures. How long can I let it roll?
Right.
It's going to expire sometime, but I'm loving it right now. But let's go to a theme that you have spoken on a lot, and that is reading well. You have a whole book on reading well, and you have a new series helping people to read various classics well. So let's dive right in. A lot of us, especially the Ansel types, believe that this is an important thing to do, but what exactly do you mean by reading well?
When I started that book project that turned into On Reading Well, I really just thought I would write about how reading great classic works of literature can teach us how to love and live life better if we read them well. But as I developed the project, I actually ended up going into the direction of the classical virtues and connecting reading well to living well. And so I ended up just connecting a classical virtue or a theological virtue to a work of literature and showing not just how a work of literature can sort of teach us a lesson about these virtues, because, literature can do that, but it's more than that. It's also about how reading well in itself forms our character because of what is required when we read good literature well. It's not just the content, but it's actually the form. As with any of the arts, it's not just what the artwork says, but it's how it communicates that to us. And I think that's something that it's so easy to forget with all of the arts, but especially with literature, because it's so easy to go around looking for lessons from works of literature. But really, there's something in the form itself that cultivates virtue if we pay attention to it.
Yeah, and that is a theme that it's just so important to keep unpacking it further, even for all of us who've been trying to do this. So, Mandy, in the green room, before we started recording, you were talking about going through this book. What were your takeaways on reading well?
Well, like she was just saying, that, like Karen was just saying, the formational aspect of it. I was an English teacher at a Christian high school for 10 years, and it's amazing to me how hard it is in some cases to convey the value of reading beyond just, reading, writing, arithmetic, to not just the students, but even the families. They don't understand. And I think a lot of that comes from just their evangelical viewpoint. They think that, well, we should just be reading the things of Jesus and the things of God. And they don't have that concept of common grace. And so I really wish I had still been teaching when this book came out, because I totally would have assigned it. I would have started every year with reading well, and perhaps requiring the parents to read it as well, just because I think if they don't understand the value of the process of reading, then they're just going through the motions. And then it's like how in the book you described that reading quickly is actually harmful, rather than, it's not even just not beneficial, it can be harmful to read too quickly. And it's the same sort of idea. You have to know how to savor, to glean as much as is offered in the text.
That's what the book says and does. Thanks. You got it.
Yay! I got an A.
Yeah, so something along that really stuck out to me is for part of my growing up, I had an education produced by a very very strict segment of the evangelical educational world. I won't name drop, but if you're in the know, you can probably guess who this was. And their reading materials for English were very, very didactic. It was like, here's a story, grab this lesson from it. Here's a story that goes against what Christianity is. Try to figure out where it goes apart from Christianity. And on a certain level, that's very satisfying, especially I can imagine if you're a teacher, it's like, well, I'm going to use this story to teach this thing. So like from X story, I get Y lesson. But it sounds like your process you're envisioning there, Karen, it goes much deeper than that surface level.
Exactly. I mean, it's helpful, I think, sometimes to think about another art form like painting. If we go to a museum, like go to my favorite place, the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., like where we could go before COVID, we don't walk around the museum to see what beautiful women look like or what vases of flowers look like or fields of flower. We don't go there to just see what they look like. We actually we look at paintings to see how an artist has used that medium, used the paint and the color and the light and the shadow and even the frame to say something about the world. And so, we read literature hopefully to do the same thing, to not just learn the lesson, but to enjoy how language can be used to get into the mind of a character, to see the world through that character or that narrator's perspective. And of course we should be judging and weighing and discerning. One of my favorite novels is Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, who created this character who is taken in by a romantic worldview that Flaubert himself thought was dangerous and wrong, and yet he creates this character in an attempt to criticize her worldview, but is such a good artist and a human being that he's actually able to sympathize with her and portray her in an empathetic way. So as readers, we're hopefully doing both of those things, kind of seeing where she goes wrong and not wanting to make those same errors ourselves, but also developing our understanding and empathy for this woman who makes these bad decisions. But by entering into her perspective, we can see why she may have been led to do that. And that's all done through words, which is amazing. It's like magic.
It is. I actually am reading that right now, and I was laughing.
What?
I am, for the first time.
What?
I know.
Let's just talk about that. How do you like it?
Oh, I love it. And I was actually laughing because I was listening to your podcast with Phil Vischer, and you mentioned it but didn't name it because you said a spoiler, and I was like, aha. I was so excited. But I already knew. Somebody else had already spoiled it for me. But no, I love it. I actually am in the part where she's just reunited with Leon or however you want to say it, at the concert. And I'm like, oh goodness, Emma. It's funny, my oldest daughter's name is Emma. And I told her, I said, if I had read Madame Bovary before you were born, your name would not be Emma. I'm just saying. I enjoy how humorous it is. It's so strange. I'm like, Gustave Flaubert was really hilarious. But I don't know how he can be that funny at the same time that it's so tragic. Although comedy and tragedy are pretty adjacent, honestly, right? But anyway, no, I love it. I'm loving it.
I'm so excited for you. Yay.
And I was telling Emma, the aforementioned my Emma, I was telling her about it, and she said, wait, so that's Madame Blueberry. And I think my head exploded. I had not realized that Madame Blueberry is Madame Bovary, which I don't know how. She's French even.
That's
Did you not either? Oh, I feel so... Or you did?
I am too old for Veggie Tales. Like, I don't know them, but I did know about it, but I never watched them. So
yeah, she's even French. I don't know how I didn't put it together. So anyway.
Brilliant.
Yes.
I remember reading Madame Bovary in college, and someone else who had the same background as me, we put it together as like, wait, Madame Bloop, wait. But
anyway.
So speaking of, a great work like Madame Bovary or something like that, something that I wrestle with a lot myself is this sort of distinction about, is it the process of reading or is it the thing that you are reading? There's this big debate. It's sometimes helpful, sometimes not, about, is it literature or is it just, like a genre book or something? Which there's lots of gray in between there. But
Right.
when we're trying to read well, would you give more emphasis to the process of reading, regardless of what it is? Or is it like, no, you really need to pick the right books here to really get all of this out of it?
That's a good question, and one I'm actually thinking about a lot, and actually writing a little something about this as I process my thoughts. I want everyone to read, and it's wonderful. Just read whatever. Reading anything is better, I think, than reading nothing, sort of. But it's interesting because when I started getting the students who'd grown up on Harry Potter and loved Harry Potter, which I have no problems with Harry Potter, but there was an interesting thing and a school administrator where I spoke a couple of years ago said this to me, confirmed it to me, that a lot of these students were just like reading Harry Potter over and over again, and just they were becoming fans. And so they really weren't developing a love and appreciation for reading in itself. They just loved that story. And when I encounter, genre fans, it is an interesting thing because I have often felt like we're talking about something different, but I didn't know what that difference was. And that's what I'm still trying to examine, because I do think that there's a difference between loving a story, no matter what form it's in, like whether it's the film or the novel, and loving literature, like loving the craft of words itself. So I don't really have an answer to that question, but it's a good one. And I think if we're reading, when I go running, I listen on Audible to like suspense and thrillers, because they're just suspenseful and I'm running, but they aren't works of literary art. Like I'm not stopping and going, wow, that was a really well-crafted phrase or something, that the way that turn of phrase is making me look at the world differently now because of the way that writer used these words. That's what literary art does. Sort of genre fiction or entertaining novels just, pass the time and are entertaining in the same way that a sitcom or television show is.
Right.
Yeah, and that's something I wrestle with a lot too. Just speaking as someone who I have a deep and abiding love for detective fiction, like Golden Age detective fiction. And if it was just up to me, that's all I'd read. But I know it's like, okay, no, I need to diversify. So like the book I'm reading right now, it's a literary book. It's not what I want to read necessarily, but I know it's better for me to do. And you don't want to just eat all the potato chips. Sometimes you need the actual steak. But it's another thing I think we could talk about for another couple podcasts worth of stuff. But
what's the work that you're reading? Do you want to share?
Yes, I'm actually reading Laurus, that Russian novel from Eugene something. Yeah, so I'm just I'm just a few chapters in. It is fascinating so far. I think the translator needs a lot of credit here because the language is absolutely beautiful. So I'm really loving it, and I'm glad I started it. But again, it was just me according to my flesh. I would be reading an Agatha Christie book. And
there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's part of the issue, is that we need to realize that reading these literary works is challenging, and there's work that's required on our end that is an investment that produces reward, and delight. But it's still some people put these kinds of books down in frustration because they find them hard. Well, they are hard. And just like any other kind of muscle that we might exercise or not exercise, we actually get better at it as we continue, as we improve and practice.
Well, when I was teaching...
Oh, go ahead, Mandy.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, when I was teaching, I remember feeling this sort of, I don't know how to explain it, like a tension as I was deciding which books to assign, particularly to the ninth graders, which I loved teaching ninth graders. But so many of them were coming in as, the kids that just announce off the bat, I hate reading. And the way I look at it as a teacher, not probably so much in the college, but for a ninth grader who's forced to take your class, they have no choice. I felt like there's an automatic taint on a book that is assigned to them because I have to read. And so I always started my ninth grade class. The first book I assigned was always Leif Enger's Peace Like a River, because I have never met anyone who did not like that book. And it always worked. And one of my most reluctant readers, his name's Caleb. I had so many Calebs, goodness. But anyway, Christian school. This one Caleb of mine, he decided, and have you both read Peace Like a River?
Mm-hmm.
Matt?
I'm partway through it, Mandy.
You're partway through. We've had this discussion before.
You got really mad at me. I gave it up because I got frustrated because I thought the legal arguments were inaccurate at the beginning.
Yeah, he's a lawyer.
And I know that's stupid.
Yeah, it is. But anyway,
reread it.
Moving on.
I don't even remember legal arguments.
That's what I told him. Exactly.
I'm not saying my response was normal. It just happened.
Well, but Caleb, actually, for the whole rest of the year, every book we read, Caleb would say, this book would be better if Swede were in it. This book would be better if Swede were in it. And the really fun thing, I actually got to tell Leif Inger that because I met him at a book signing, and he loved that. But I think even as we get older, it's certain books that we approach it like, oh, well, I have to take my vitamins. And to be honest, that's how when I started reading Madame Bovary, I'm like, it's time I read Madame Bovary, because I'm kind of an American fiction junkie, American classic literature, Steinbeck, Flannery O'Connor, etc. But I was like, no, I need to broaden my horizons. And I love it. I like it a lot better than British literature in general.
I'll forgive you for that.
Literature. I like British literature, but
at the end. Okay.
I know, but it is really funny that on page 22, Monsieur Bovary was already getting married for the second time. I mean, in an English novel, they wouldn't have made eye contact yet. I mean, am I right?
Yeah, that's true. Good point.
So what you both were saying there, and I think is really valuable. It's reading well it's almost like exercising. You may not necessarily want to do it at the beginning, but it's good for you. You'll always be glad there's all these long-lasting benefits that come from the grind. So, Karen, there's a flip side to that, too, where you've talked in other forums about the dangers of not doing this sort of thing. So when someone doesn't do this sort of thing, like reading well, exercising their imagination, what are some downsides that can happen because of that?
Oh, boy, just look at my Twitter feed. And, I think that there's let me give you a negative example. George Orwell's 1984, this, famous dystopian novel. If you haven't even read it, you've heard of it. And if you haven't read it, then you need to know that the whole totalitarian government's power is rooted in its narrowing of language, reducing the number of words drastically that are in the language. And what happens when you reduce the words is you actually reduce human thought. You reduce the categories, you reduce the nuances. Everything becomes, just black and white and hardly any shades. And so when we not only reduce our vocabulary, but even reduce our understanding of the metaphorical layers of language, then we are flattening human experience, we're flattening our relationships, we're flattening our understanding of the world. And so literary language gives us a deeper, richer sense of our thought and relationship and our ability to interact with other people. I mean, even just normal conversations that we have with people, so often the conflict or the misunderstanding or disagreement arises out of what you meant when you said this, or how you said this, or I didn't mean that, or what do you mean by that? I mean, just think of how much of our lives revolve around communication and misunderstanding because of the way that we use words. And so the more skilled that we are at using words, the more we will be able to understand one another. And even in this polarized time where there's so much that we're disagreeing on, we often don't even know what it is that we are actually disagreeing on because we're using words in different ways or they have different meanings. And so just to be able to relate to one another, I think we need to have more skillful language, and then the imagination that comes with that to just even be able to imagine that this person that I disagree with politically or theologically, just to be able to imagine, well, you know what, maybe he's thinking about it this way, or just is trying to do this and isn't the worst person in the world that people might think. These are the gifts that literature gives us, is this broadened perspective, the ability to understand how someone could think something and maybe be wrong, but still be trying to get, to the right place just like we are. Yes, those are just the things off the top of my head.
Well, that is a very good list. It's a very good list. And Mandy, I will say one of the things I admire about you, Mandy, is you will engage people on social issues on social media where I am afraid to engage because I'm afraid of getting the crazy blowback that you get sometimes. But I'm guessing you can relate to seeing this sort of lack of empathy, lack of imagination, lack of understanding shades of meaning just in communication all around you, right?
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
is that to Mandy or me?
Oh man, I was sort of throwing it out in a vague way. I,
No, I mean that I think that's what's characterizing our world today, all of those
yeah.
things. It's not that literature is going to make everyone a better
Oh,
person, but I certainly think that we are,
oh, I do.
we're living in we're li we're living in this culture that is we're fed by the distortions of the news we watch and the headlines we read that are not
You
nuanced,
haven't
and
seen
so that's
my Facebook Messenger.
Oh, uh-oh. I think
Oh,
Mandy's a little
oh,
bit behind us on the
I
feed.
think
Let's
you
hold up
were.
just a sec. Let's now go on to talking about wanted to sort of narrow this issue down a little bit because Karen, one of the things you talk about a lot is these sort of issues, but especially within like the evangelical Christian context. And I'm part of that world as well. And we mentioned this already, but do you notice any particular issues that evangelicals have with engaging the arts, reading deeply? What have you noticed?
well, I think as we Mandy alluded to earlier, I think in the teaching context, teaching in a Christian school, evangelicals, like I think the rest of modern American culture,
Hmm.
has been influenced by kind of a utilitarian and consumeristic mindset that values things that are practical, things that are, that get the point across, get the job done, efficiency, things that are easy to consume and not as challenging. And again, I think this is reflective of the larger American culture. It's not
Hmm.
just, evangelicals, but we of all people should actually be the ones who celebrate sort of the artistic, the creativity that
Hmm.
we as human beings have that actually reflects the nature of God. And yet we don't. So we tend, I think there are a number of reasons for why there's this reluctance to embrace the arts. Part of it is because good art is often deals in the gray. It doesn't deal
Hmm.
with sort of the direct certain answer. It also tends to be very sort of sensory. It appeals to our carnal aspect of being humans rather than our spiritual one, our sense of taste and touch and smell and hearing. And we're nervous about that. And we're nervous oftentimes about the hard questions, the things that don't lead to a directly black and white answer. And so the arts just kind of traffic in the things that we often are most nervous about or that we resist because we have the one true answer in Jesus, and we
Hmm.
want to find the answers in everything else, and art resists that.
Yeah, absolutely. To your first point about the utilitarian thing, you're definitely right that this is sort of a common human thing, but it's very prominent in certain segments of the evangelical church. And it's one of those things, if that's what you're going in with that attitude, it's very hard to convince you otherwise. You'll see some very well-meaning like school administrators every now and then, defend the humanities by saying like, hey, you can use your English degree to, like write contracts or, do this or that. And it's like, well, yeah, like, I'm a lawyer and I was an English major, and I do think majoring in English has made me a better lawyer in some ways, but if I just wanted to be a lawyer, there are easier ways for me to do that than getting an English degree. There's more direct routes to it. So if we just go the utilitarian route, we're sort of giving the game away. And I especially like what you said about the certainty aspect, where there's definitely this fear of letting something sort of hang in the gray or not be really resolved. And I think that is a human thing in a lot of ways too, but that you can definitely see it prominently, especially among evangelical art consumers. And I guess what I would say to someone like that, because I know a lot of very well-meaning, sweet, godly people who feel that way. What would you say to them to say, hey, we don't need all the pieces together. Let's just enjoy this art and wrestle with it.
Yeah, I mean, that is a hard but important question. It really just goes back to even just the fact that we are here on this earth and that we are living this life before we spend eternity with the Lord. I mean, why would God have put us here on this earth and given us these earthly lives when he could have just created us for his glory, and brought us to him immediately? So there's a reason why we're here in this, in between place. And so part of the reason that we are here is to work out our salvation in fear and trembling, right? And so that means that there are questions that aren't answered. There is sickness, there is pain, there is difficulty, and even the crucifixion of Christ himself, his sacrifice for us, is something that is painful and hard. And so if we turn away from those realities, then we're turning away from our very human existence and what God is trying to do in our lives. And so any shortcuts or any denial of these realities is really, I think, a denial of the work that God is doing in his human creation, collectively and in our own lives. So art allows us. And to go back to the example of Madame Bovary, I mean, one of the reasons why this novel is so important to me is because I read it in college for the first time at a pivotal point in my life where I really think that I could have ended up just like Madame Bovary if I hadn't read this novel. So I got to avoid making her mistakes because of this work of art that allowed me to kind of navigate and think in that way without actually doing it.
Yeah, I mean, you could see the plot of Madame Bovary being written by, a lesser writer in making Madame Bovary such a ridiculous or absurd character that you don't sympathize with her. But because he made Madame Bovary such a sympathetic character, because he gave her such depth, you as a reader can really take a step into her shoes and really learn the lessons from her without actually having to make the same mistakes. And it's all a part of the wrestling there. And something... You mentioned this earlier when you talked about being anchored as Christians, and I think that's incredibly important too. One of the things I have been really trying to work on recently is just being more comfortable admitting I don't know something. It used to be when I would read an article or see something that I couldn't instantly fit into my neat little theological boxes. I'd go into a cocoon and be like, oh no, is everything crumbling? But now I'm trying to do this more and more. It's like, I don't know how that all fits together. But I still know these things about my faith. I'm sure it does somehow. I just don't know it. Maybe I never will. Just go about your day. That's one of the benefits you get from doing the wrestling. And talking about wrestling, you have started giving us some concrete examples with your latest series of books, the Guides to Reading and Reflecting. So tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah, this is a series. It will, in the end, be 6 volumes of classics that I've picked out that are, in my field of expertise and that I'm passionate about. I mean, there's so many, it was hard to narrow down to 6, but also I picked 6 that I think have a particular resonance for where we are as a church today. And so these are works that are, because they're in the public domain, they can be republished. And so my publisher and I have designed these volumes to be beautiful, they're hardbound with thick paper and larger font that's easy on the eyes and wide margins. And I've written introductions to these, footnoted them lightly with, explaining some of the obscure words or places or terms, and then loaded them up with lots of discussion and reflection questions that reflect a biblical worldview, but also just literary analysis. So each volume ends up being kind of like taking a class with me in studying these books. And so the ones that were just released this spring are Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And last year, the first volumes were Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility and Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And next year, Lord willing, will be Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter.
Oh, man. Well, that is great. I will say that I was assigned Tess of the D'Urbervilles in high school, and that book wrecked me. In a really good way, but it wrecked me. I was like oh my goodness. I was like the token only guy in my AP English classes. It did a number on me.
Well, then you read it well because you understood it, because it is a book that will wreck you. I can't wait to share that one with the world. It seems like a lot of people don't have it. That's not a book that's read as often. I mean, it's kind of long and it's wordy, but it's so good. And yeah.
Well, it really is good, and like Tess is such a sympathetic character, but not in like again, it would in a lesser hand. You can see it just being like a sappy, mawkish story about this poor person, blah blah blah. But she's such a real person going through all that, and yeah, it earned the sympathy of a 17-year-old boy who is trying to act tough. So that's best compliment I can give to Hardy. But let's talk about some of these other books that you've selected because I'm looking through them. It looks like you've going across genres. Some are going to be, the things that you picture girls reading. Some like Heart of Darkness. It's the inspiration for Apocalypse Now. So looks like you tried to pick these with a wide swath of readers in mind. Am I getting it at something there?
You're exactly right. I mean,
Okay.
of course, they are older works of literature.
Mm-hmm.
They're again, copyright issues come into play when you're talking about anything that's in the 20th or 21st century, so that can eliminate a lot of works. And they are all novels, because that is my area of passion and expertise. And again, it's only 6, so I really tried to, within those 6, pick a pretty broad range that would appeal to a lot of different readers, and yes, including men and women, because we know that women tend to buy more books and to read more fiction, especially among Christians. And I've been on a long campaign to help pastors and theologians and to understand that fiction is not light, it's not frivolous. If you read a good book well, it is the same as reading theology or philosophy, which I like those too. Yep. But fiction often gets a bad rap from the people who think of themselves as heavy-hitting thinkers.
Oh, absolutely. There's definitely that genre of dude who usually really likes Elon Musk and is like, oh, I don't have enough time to spend on literature. I'm too busy, doing that. But so I want to talk a little bit about Sense and Sensibility if we could. So, Karen, I will give you a confession. Let's go back to my college days when I was an English major. I was trying very hard, many college boys are wont to do, to impress the girls. So I bought a copy of Pride and Prejudice, a very big, pretty one, and put it on my bookshelf so that girls who walked by would read it. It was like, oh, this Matt, he must be a sensitive dude. Okay. But then here's the twist. I started reading it, and gosh darn it, I loved it. So I read the whole thing. I'm a Jane Austen fan now. So what about Jane Austen in general, and Sense and Sensibility in particular, really lends itself to this sort of guide that you're doing?
Well, my respect for you just keeps going up and up with each book you talk about that you loved. I mean, here's the thing. So many people only know of Jane Austen from the pop culture versions, like the film adaptations, and she just doesn't adapt that well to film because her novels are satirical. They are novels of manners, and Austen is a moral philosopher writing about ethics. And yet that gets captured not so much in the plot, although that's part of it, but really more in her satirical tone, in the sophistication of her narrator who's making these judgments and observations about this world that she's painting. And that's hard to translate into film. But if you read the novels, then you are introduced into the mind of someone who is brilliant and witty and, yes, judging her society and judging the manners and customs and follies and foibles, but also doing so lovingly and in a way that is prone to self-correction. Like you read Jane Austen and you just think, and you're laughing at her characters and you think, well, I don't want to be like that. And so you correct yourself. So I knew when I was doing this series that I would include an Austen novel, and then it was just a matter of, okay, so which one? And Pride and Prejudice is my favorite. Many people's favorites for good reason. Sense and Sensibility is actually one of her earlier novels, and it's a little, I admit, it's a little rough. It's not as polished as Pride and Prejudice. Yet I think people need to read it, and so that's why one reason I chose it. But another is that I think that the main theme of the novel, which is Sense and Sensibility, no spoilers there, which really are the late 18th century terms that correspond to reason and emotion. So if you think of it that way, that her book is about reason and emotion, we have so much trouble balancing those things in our culture today, especially in the church. I think we tend to be in communities that either emphasize reason at the expense of emotion or emphasize emotion at the expense of reason, when, as Austen shows in this novel very delightfully, they need to be harmonized and brought into balance. And that's really what the novel is about. And so, using this story of these two sisters who are trying to find love like everyone is in Jane Austen's novels, but there's just a much deeper theme there. And I think it's very important for us one that's needed today.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a couple of points to add on to what you said. Definitely the satirical tone does not come through well in most of the Jane Austen adaptations, but also just the dialogue. Like the thing that first snagged me on Pride and Prejudice, reading as the, 20-year-old college dude, the first chapter, the conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, I thought was just pitch perfect dialogue. It was funny. It was satirical, but not in a cruel way. It was sort of satirical, but you got the feeling Jane Austen still had an affection for her sometimes ridiculous characters. And it was just so good. And you need to read the book to get the full thing. So going back to the way I'm interested in how you go about doing these, reading and reflecting questions and how you get it so that it feels like something you really want to wrestle with and not just like make it seem like an assignment, but it's like, oh, this is something I really want to sink my teeth into after reading this chapter. How'd you go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I actually, when I started this series, it occurred to me partway through, before I was finishing the first volumes, that so many times there are countless editions of these classics all over, cheap paperbacks or nice volumes, and the introductions are often done by literary scholars for a different purpose, and they will talk about the major events in the novel. They have spoilers. And there's just something so delightful about reading a novel for the first time and not knowing what's going to happen that I committed to not including any spoilers in the introductions, which was hard. But I still give a lot of content. I basically want to equip readers to enter the novel with enough background information. So then it's in the discussion questions after each most of these novels were published originally in 3 volumes, so we have them divided up that way in the book. So after each volume, just asking questions about, and I've been in the classroom, teaching in the classroom for 3 decades, so I think, I'm pretty good at asking leading questions, using the Socratic method to help students or readers kind of find the entry point. So I ask questions that are, some of the questions don't have a correct answer, but some of the questions are just designed to help you notice what's important or notice what you might have missed in just simply reading it. So there are plenty of questions there that direct readers back to the major events or uses of language and so forth that after each section, and then a section of overall reflection questions to think about after having read the whole thing.
Great. So something that I was thinking about when you're talking about it, what would you picture the ideal reading environment to be for these? Would you prefer someone to be like, all right, I'm going to take this, go underneath a tree by myself and wrestle with them on my own? Or would you rather people go like, hey, let's get like a little book group together and discuss each one as we go?
Honestly, I think both work. I've heard from readers who are doing both. I think I was really more imagining someone reading the book alone, so I wrote the questions in such a way that that person could be directed back. But of course, they would, they can be used in a book discussion club. There are more questions than you could ever get through, so you'd have to probably pick and choose. But I think they work equally well for the solo reader or for a book club discussion that's in person or even online. So I wanted people to get their money's worth out of these books. So there are plenty of questions there.
Yeah, and I'm going to rein myself in because I love Frankenstein so much. I love the book. I got introduced to the movies when I was a kid, which I understand totally different animals, except Bride of Frankenstein sort of, it has some elements, but the book is completely different. My favorite tidbit to share people about this, first of all, Mary Shelley, she was like 20, which, come on, that's not even fair. But her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, almost ruins it when he does his notes to it. I just love picturing the great poet, oh, honey, that's cute, you wrote this novel. I'll add my corrections, and he almost ruined it. But very briefly, because I want to talk about Frankenstein a bunch, but what did you think, why do you think Frankenstein made such a good addition to this collection you've been curating?
Yeah, so I think Frankenstein is a book that has wide appeal to both men and women readers. That was, part of my goal is I wanted to attract people who maybe weren't fiction readers. And I think, it is, this novel taps into so many archetypal, mythological questions that have pervaded human existence since human beings existed, like, what is the responsibility of the creator toward his creation? What are the limits of scientific knowledge? And just because we can do something, should we do it? These are eternal, lasting questions that we're still grappling with today. And then sort of the fact that it's just an amazing story that has captured our cultural imagination in so many ways. That just is a testimony to the power of the story that this teenager wrote and published. And I thought that in this series Jane Eyre would be the one that would take off and that everyone would ignore Frankenstein, but Frankenstein has gotten a lot of attention. I'm actually really kind of happy because Jane Eyre will always be there and everyone will love Jane Eyre, but I'm glad that Frankenstein is getting his due.
Yes, exactly. Jane Eyre, we all know that. It has its fans. It'll always be there. But Frankenstein, let's remember the book and not just the guy in green with the bolts in his neck. He's cool, right. But let's focus on the book too. So we are actually just about winding down on time. So Karen, thank you so much. This was such a great talk. Thank you for joining us here. Before we go, where can we find you? Where can we find your work?
Well, I have a website. It's not very fancy, but you can kind of get the basics there, KarenSwallowPrior.com. And you can always find me on Twitter. I'm there too much. That's at KSPRIOR, KS Prior. And I also, I like to post pretty pictures of everyday things on Instagram. So you can find me on Instagram at KarenSwallowPrior.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much. And as you all can tell, listeners, things are winding down at the Ansel Digital Pub. The fire's down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time.